Great to be with you, church. We are wrapping up the book of Ruth this morning. Just a short series, just 4 weeks, just a couple of pages in our Old Testament, and yet the story of Ruth is a powerful story, so much about how God works in unexpected ways, about who God uses. And today, you're going to see a story that tells you that our God is a God who redeems, who takes broken things, who takes hopeless things, and brings new life and new goodness and new blessing out of them. He does that for Ruth in this story, and he can still do that for you today. So we're going to pick that up. I want to get you caught up on where we are. We've been following the story of Ruth and Naomi. Naomi was married to a guy named Elimelech, and there was a famine in the land, and Elimelech decided that he was going to take his family to Moab. And it wasn't a good decision. God had warned his people not to go to Moab, but he was desperate, and so they went there, and it ended up tragically. He died, leaving Naomi a widow. They had 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They both died as well. And Mahlon was married to Ruth, to a young Moabite woman who was also left a widow. And Naomi and Ruth now are the only ones left. They're sticking it out together. They've moved back to Judah, to the town of Bethlehem, where they're trying to make a life for themselves, but it hasn't been easy. 2 widows in this time would have had a very hard time just making a living, and they've been actually having to beg for food. They've been relying on the generosity of strangers, and one of those strangers was a man named Boaz, a wealthy landowner in that time, a godly man, and he took pity on Ruth. He showed her kindness. He allowed her to glean grain from his fields. And we also learn in our story that Boaz is potentially what was known as a family redeemer. Boaz was a relative of Ruth's dead husband, Mahlon. And what that meant in this time was that he could choose to marry Ruth and redeem the family line that had died out when Ruth's husband died. At this point, Naomi has no sons, no grandsons, no one to carry on the family name, and yet Boaz was the kind of person who could change that. And so last week, we looked at a very colorful proposal story when Ruth asked Boaz if he would marry her, if he would become the family redeemer, and he said yes. He said, I will do that, but there was a catch, and that's where we're going to pick up our story this morning. The catch was this. The way the customs of the time worked, it was that the closest relative to the husband who died was the one who had the first option to become the family redeemer. And Boaz says, there's actually a relative closer than me. There's someone who is closer to your dead husband who could redeem you first. And so before I can marry you, we have to go get things sorted out with him. This proposal took place in the dead of night. Interesting story. Go back and watch it last week if you missed it. It's the next morning now. We've woken up, and Boaz is about to get to work. He's going to go sort things out with this other person who could be the family redeemer. That's Ruth chapter 4, verse 1. Here we go. Boaz went to the gate of the town and sat down there. Soon the family redeemer Boaz had spoken about came by. Boaz said, "Come over here and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz finds the guy he's talking about, the closer relative. Interestingly, we never get a name in our story of who this guy is. And so together, we're just going to call him Gold Digger Gary, and I'll explain why later. So Boaz sees Gary in the street. He says, "Gary, come over here. We got to have a chat." So they sit down together, and then Boaz kind of pulls a fast one on him. Okay, so this is verse 2. Then Boaz took 10 men of the town's elders and said, "Sit here," and they sat down also. So Gary thinks he's going to have a little friendly chat with Boaz, and Boaz says, "Oh, by the way, I also invited 10 elders to the town, and they're here as well." And what Boaz has done is he's put together a little family court here. They're going to figure out what's going to happen with Ruth and Naomi, and Boaz wants to make sure the elders are there to ensure that it's handled fairly and that what's agreed upon actually is followed through on, to make sure that Gary can't pull a fast one. So the elders are all there, and then Boaz begins. He said to Gold Digger Gary, "Naomi, who has returned from the territory of Moab, is selling the portion of the field that belonged to our brother Elimelech. Your relative Elimelech is dead. His land is now up for sale," although this really is a little bit of a confusing term, okay? Because Naomi isn't selling the land. There's going to be no money that changes hands here. Really what this is saying is that the land is going to be transferred. See, Naomi actually is not legally allowed to own this land. It isn't because she's a woman necessarily. Women actually in Israel were allowed to own property. But this land is land that must stay in the family of Elimelech and the family as it goes through the male side of marriages. Naomi, because she's not in Elimelech's line, is not allowed to own this land. And so even though she's the widow, she can't own it. She can't profit off of it. And so it needs to be transferred to someone who is a relative of Elimelech. Now, I don't know about you, that sits a little bit wrong with us today. It feels like it's unfair to Naomi that she's not allowed to keep living on this land. That was her family land. She was married to Elimelech, and it has to go to someone else. And especially in our culture today, where we value property rights and women being treated equally to men, like it feels kind of icky that God would have a law that says that Naomi can't keep this land. And before we get too judgy, I just want us to recognize that cultures are different, and different cultures value things differently. And just because this was a long time ago in a very different culture doesn't mean it was worse or less fair. See, God had laws about land in this time, and the point of those laws was to make sure that no one got too rich and that no one was too poor. It was about keeping there from being a huge wealth gap in society. So the same land that was given to one tribe and one family, it stayed in that family generation after generation. That's why God instituted things like the year of Jubilee, where the land that was sold all went back to its original owner. God's interested not just in individual rights, but in a community and a people where fairness exists and where one bad year, one drought, or one untimely death doesn't plunge a family into poverty for generations. So we kind of look down our nose at a culture like this that doesn't value Naomi the way that we would want a culture to value Naomi. But honestly, if they were there looking at us, they might look down their nose at us, because we do a really good job of ensuring individual rights, but maybe not as good of a job at building fair societies for us to live in. Right? The United States today, our wealth, the top 1% of households own more wealth than the bottom 90% of households combined. So let's not be judgy. Let's just acknowledge every culture has its own issues, ours included. And in this culture, Naomi's not allowed to own this land. She has to give it away to one of Elimelech's relatives. And so Boaz is explaining this to Gary. And he says, Gary, it's your lucky day. You're the closest relative. You get the land. I thought I should inform you. Buy it back in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you want to redeem it, do it. But if you do not want to redeem it, tell me so that I will know, because there isn't anyone other than you to redeem it, and I am the next after you. If you want Elimelech's property, you can have it. If you don't want it, let me know, because I'm next in line and I will take it. Now, if you were Gary and somebody said, hey, like, you inherited land, do you want it or not? How long would you have to think about it? He doesn't have to think about it very long either. I want to redeem it, he answered. Sounds like a deal to me. I'll take the land. I will be the honorable person and take this free land. And if you're following the story, this is where your heart kind of sinks, because we've been rooting for Boaz and Ruth to get together. Boaz is the hero, right? He's the godly, wealthy man who took pity on Ruth and loved her and showed faithfulness to her and called out what God had been doing in her life. I mean, all this great stuff with Boaz, and now this unnamed person is just going to marry her, and that's how the story's going to end? That can't be how it ends, right? But thankfully, Boaz still has a couple cards up his sleeve. He says, oh yeah, I did forget to mention, there's a little bit of fine print to this deal. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from Naomi, you will acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the deceased man, to perpetuate the man's name on his property. Oh yeah, you do have to marry Ruth the Moabitess. Now, again, it's kind of doesn't sit great with us, this terminology, you will acquire Ruth as if she's property. But that's actually not what this is saying. This isn't saying that he's going to own Ruth. He's saying if you take the land, you are also acquiring the duty, the responsibility, the obligation to care for Ruth, to marry her, to provide a living for her, to treat her as your own wife. Also, you're going to acquire the obligation to care for Naomi, her mother-in-law. This land is going to come with some responsibility as well. And this is where Gary earns his name, because once he finds out that it's not just free land and he actually has to do something honorable, he's out of here. The Redeemer replied, I can't redeem it myself, or I will ruin my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption because I can't redeem it. Actually, I'm good. No, I don't want this. We don't know exactly what he's saying here when he says he will ruin his own inheritance. It's possible that he's saying that he doesn't have enough money to actually care for Ruth and Naomi. It will bankrupt him if he takes on that responsibility. It's also possible that when he realized that he was going to have to be a family redeemer, that he and Ruth would likely have a son, that first son that they have actually wouldn't belong to him. It would belong to Ruth's dead husband, Mahlon. And when that son grew up, the son would actually get the land, not this person who's being offered the right of redemption. So he realizes there's really nothing in it for him any longer. It's also possible that there's a little bit of racism going on here, that he has no interest in spending his life with a Moabite woman, but we don't know exactly. We just know as soon as he realizes there's strings attached, he backs out. And that clears the way for the happy ending of the story that we have been waiting for Ruth and Boaz to get married. And they waste no time. Boaz declares his intentions right in front of the whole town. This is how our story comes to an end. Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses today that I am buying from Naomi everything that belonged to Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife to perpetuate the deceased man's name on his property so that his name will not disappear among his relatives or from the gate of his hometown. You are my witnesses today. Boaz says, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to marry Ruth. We're going to start a family together. When we have a son, that son is going to redeem the family line of Elimelech. His name will go on through that son. Naomi now is a part of our family. Ruth has family. He is going to redeem everything. And as we said last week, Boaz is really the embodiment of God's grace in this story. This is the story of God bringing redemption to everything that was broken. And I want to show you just how that redemption works in this story, because it's so much more complex than you might even realize at first. See, we are used to romance movies and stories that end in weddings as a common thing. And in our culture, typically a wedding is the redemption of our loneliness, of the character not finding the person that they wanted to be with. And now they're going to have this happily ever after wedding where they find satisfaction in their marriage. That's kind of the Western idea of a happy ending to a romance story. This is about so much more than that. This is about a marriage, about wedding. I'm sure there's some romance involved, but this is about God working to redeem the deepest brokenness of every character in this story, and I want to show you how that works. So I want to show you 5 redemption stories. This series we called Ruin to Redemption, because that's what this is all about. And so we will start with the most obvious one. The first redemption story in this narrative, it tells us that God is faithful to redeem Ruth from isolation. Now, this isn't just redeeming Ruth from loneliness because her husband is dead. This is about redeeming Ruth from having no family, no marriage, no husband, no community even. And to understand how that works, we have to go back to the beginning of our story, to where Ruth was at after her husband was dead and she moves back to Bethlehem. Now, she is a Moabite woman, which means she would not have been accepted easily into that society. The Jewish people were not very fond of the Moabites. And you can see how Ruth carries that as an identity early in the story. So when she meets Boaz for the first time, when Boaz starts showing some kindness towards her, this is how Ruth responds in chapter 2. She fell face down, bowed to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor with you, so that you notice me, although I am a foreigner?" That word is how Ruth sees herself at that point in the story, that she is a foreigner. She's an outsider. She doesn't belong. When Boaz starts treating her kindly, she says, "Why are you doing this? You know that I'm not a part of your community. I'm not a part of your family. I am an outsider." That's Ruth before Boaz redeems her. But I want to show you something really cool, which is I want you to see how the town responds when Boaz announces this wedding. When he says, we're going to get married, look at how the people, the Jewish people in Bethlehem, respond to that news. This is verse 11 of chapter 4. All the people who were at the city gate, including the elders, said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is entering your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built the house of Israel. May you be powerful in Ephrathah and your name well known in Bethlehem. They're cheering for Ruth. This is the people welcoming her into their family. They're calling her like Rachel and Leah, two of the matriarchs of the tribe of Judah. Ruth now is not an outsider any longer. She's not a foreigner. She has family. She has people. She has community. That will be the rest of the story of her life. She will hold babies in her arms. She will see grandchildren born and grow up. She'll attend weddings and funerals. That is the community that God has given her when she was an outsider who had none of that. And this story of God's redemption, it is just an echo of what he can still do in our life as well. When you follow Jesus, you are offered a family. You are offered new brothers and sisters, new relationships that can never be taken away, new relationships that will go on in all of eternity as you come into the family of God and join the story of all of us who have been redeemed by Jesus. That's why we talk so much about connection here at Alderwood, because following Jesus is about so much more than just something God does in you individually. He does transform you. He does forgive you individually of your sin and give you a hope and a future. But really the story of God is a story about what he's doing with a community, with a people, with a family. And so we want to live that out as a church and love one another as brothers and sisters because that's who we are. The second redemption arc that we see in this story is a little bit different. It's a little unique, actually. It's one that you probably weren't expecting. Okay, this is the second redemption arc in the story of Ruth. That God is faithful to redeem the line of Judah from dishonor. Let's dig into that a little bit. Okay, the line of Judah. Boaz is a descendant of Judah who founded the tribe of Judah. These are his people. And Judah has some family baggage in it. There are some things that have not gone well in their history, and this is a story of that baggage being redeemed. So let's get back in Ruth 4 here for a second. Boaz has announced that they're going to get married. The townspeople are cheering. They're yelling out blessings on this new couple. This is the next blessing, and it's a little bit of a weird one. They say, may your house become like the house of Perez, the son Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring the Lord will give you by this young woman. May your house be like the house of Perez. It's beautiful, isn't it? I mean, you know Perez. My guess is that you don't know Perez because the Bible says basically nothing about this guy. Like, he's this obscure character in Genesis 38. We're given 2 verses about him. Basically, we're told he was born. He was one of a set of twins. He came out first. That's the end of what the Bible has to say about Perez. And so it's really weird that in the book of Ruth, they're all shouting the name of Perez. We're like, why Perez? Well, you may have noticed the other names in that verse. Perez is the son of Judah and Tamar. And that makes it even weirder because Judah and Tamar are much more well-known than Perez is, but they're not really famous. They're kind of more notorious. Judah and Tamar is not an awesome story. It's a weird one to bring up at an engagement party, okay? Here's the story of Judah and Tamar. Tamar, like all good romances begin, was Judah's daughter-in-law, right? So Tamar was married to Judah's son. The son died. Tamar became a widow with no sons to carry on the family name. Does that sound familiar in the book of Ruth? Tamar is in need of a family redeemer. And now Judah, it falls to him to do the honorable thing, to provide a family redeemer for Tamar to restore her honor. But he won't do it. He has a younger son, and he says, when my son grows up, he will marry you and be your family redeemer. But then the son grows up, and Judah doesn't do that. And so Tamar is left in this shameful, dishonorable spot with no hope of being redeemed because Judah won't do the right thing. So Tamar decides to take things into her own hands. And she figures out a way to trick Judah into being her family redeemer, even without him knowing it. And here's how she does it. She apparently has heard some rumors that when Judah goes on business trips, when he's out of town, he likes to hire the company of young women to spend the night with. And so she figures out where he's going to go, and she goes ahead of him on the road, and she dresses up like a prostitute. She pretends to be a prostitute. She covers her face, and wouldn't you know it, when Judah walks by, he asks if he can sleep with her. She says yes, and they do. And Judah doesn't know that this is Tamar, his daughter-in-law. He thinks she's just some foreign prostitute. And so it's over. They go back home, and several months go by. Now Tamar is showing because she's pregnant. And Judah, when he finds out that she's pregnant, is righteously indignant about this. She's an unmarried woman. She shouldn't be having sex with anyone, and so she needs to be stoned to death. And before that can happen, Tamar says, well, actually, one thing, you should know who the father is. The father is the owner of this ring. And out of her pocket, she pulls Judah's ring because he's the father of her baby. That's the story of Judah and Tamar. The baby's name, the family redeemer son, is Perez. Why would you bring that up at someone's engagement party, right? I mean, we all have stuff in our family we don't want anyone to talk about. So here's one of mine. This is kind of an amazing thing I found out about my ancestors. If you can't make this out, this is a gravestone in Massachusetts. It reads, Susanna Martin, hanged July 19th, 1692. This is one of my ancestors. Susanna came over on the Mayflower, or one of those ships in that time. She was a Puritan. She was escaping religious persecution in England. And apparently Susanna was kind of a feisty lady, and she didn't keep her opinions to herself. And in that time, it wasn't a good thing to make enemies if you were a woman, because there was something going on called the Salem witch trials. I'm sure you've heard of it. And Susanna was accused of being a witch, and she was hung. And it's kind of dark. I'm not ashamed of it. She actually probably was a great lady and was falsely accused, but that's part of my past. And I just want you to think about how weird it would be if when I married Kate and we were showing up to our wedding our reception, if everyone started cheering, may your house be like the house of Susanna Martin. Why bring her up? I don't want to think about that right now. I just got married. But that's what they're doing to Boaz and Ruth. May your house be like Judah and Tamar's son. But here's the reason. It is because Ruth and Boaz's story is the redemption of that dark chapter of Boaz's family history. See, where Judah failed to honor the widow Tamar, where he failed to do his duty and love her and provide a family redeemer, Boaz steps up and does the right thing. And he doesn't have to be deceived into doing it. He does it because he loves God and wants to honor Ruth, this young widow who's in need of help. Now, the line of Judah won't just be remembered for Judah doing all the horrible things that Judah did. Now, the line of Judah will be remembered also for Boaz righteously honoring Ruth at her time of need. This is a story of redemption, and it is a story that tells us that God is capable of redeeming even our worst family baggage. Thanksgiving is this week, and we get to hang out with extended family. For some of us, that's really joyous. For some of us, it's not. Maybe you have family members that you don't really like to bring up or talk about or think about. Maybe some of the closest relationships in your life, or what should be the closest relationships in your life, are actually the hardest relationships in your life. Whatever family baggage you have, this is a story that tells you that God can redeem more than you even could hope or imagine. And that redemption, it might come in your generation. It might come in your kids' generation. It might come in your grandkids' generation. You might have to wait even for the new heavens and the new earth. But God's not done writing the story of your family. And if he could bring redemption to Judah, he can bring it to you as well. The next redemption arc is this. God is faithful to redeem Elimelech from worthlessness, from failure. Elimelech was Naomi's husband. He was the patriarch of the family. And in our story, he's portrayed as being about the biggest failure that you could possibly imagine. So we're only told a little bit about him in the beginning of the story. This is the very first verse of the book of Ruth. This is how the story starts. During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land, and a man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to stay in the territory of Moab for a while. This man is Elimelech. And so really the only thing Elimelech does in this story is he disobeys God, he takes his family to Moab, And in doing so, he finds absolute ruin. He dies, his 2 sons die. There's now no one left to carry on the family name, which means Elimelech and his line are going to be completely wiped from the pages of history. No one will remember them. His story comes to an end right here. If you're a man living in this time, in this culture, the thing that you are made to do, your purpose in life, is to continue on your family and to bring honor to your family, to take what is handed to you from your father and his father before him, to build on it, to bring security to your family. Like, that's what being a man is about, which means that Elimelech has failed completely in the most important thing to him. In this day and age, they had certain kind of insults that you could sling at someone, like we have, different curse words and things you could say to people that you really hate. In this time, like, the worst thing you could tell someone, it's this Hebrew phrase, and it says this in English: "May your seed perish and your name die out." That's like the lowest low thing you could say to someone. Now today we hear that and we're like, all right, whatever, man. I don't care. But at that time, that was the worst possible outcome, and that's exactly what Elimelech has gotten himself here. No heirs, no sons. His name will be forgotten forever. Until Ruth chapter 4, verse 13. We're told what happens as Ruth and Boaz get married. Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He slept with her, and the Lord granted conception to her, and she gave birth to a son. And as that son was born, and the first time you heard the cries of that new baby, that was the sound of Elimelech's whole life being turned right side up again. Because that baby is Elimelech's grandson. He will carry on the family name. He will ensure that Elimelech is not forgotten, and now his purpose in life has been fulfilled even after he died. In fact, Elimelech, far from being forgotten and dying in obscurity, became so well known that we know his name thousands of years later at a different time, in a different place. Elimelech becomes a part of the story of God's redemption through Jesus, all because of his faithfulness through Boaz, through Ruth, to bring a family redeemer. And God can do that same thing for us today. Your biggest failures, your biggest disappointments, and really the stuff that matters to you, the way that you failed to be the parent that you wanted to be, right? The business that you started and poured all of your money into that actually failed, the future in your career that you saw ahead of you and just vanished from right in your grasp. The biggest disappointments you have, God is big enough to redeem. And he may not redeem it the way that you want to, but he can bring you worth and value and purpose that comes from more than what you can accomplish here in this world. When you follow Jesus, you become a son. You become a daughter of the living God. That's something that can never be taken away from you. We also see, this is Naomi's story. We see that God is faithful to redeem Naomi from desperation. If you've been with us, you know that Naomi hasn't been doing so well in this story. Her husband dies, her 2 sons die. She becomes so disappointed, so bitter about what was going on, she even changes her name in the first chapter. Her name, Naomi, it means pleasant or sweet, and she says this in chapter 1, "Don't call me Naomi, don't call me pleasant, call me Mara." Mara means bitter in Hebrew. "Call me bitter," she answered. "For the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." God took everything from me. I have nothing left. I have nothing worth living for. That's her story in chapter 1. But look where God brings her by the end of this story. The women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you without a family redeemer today. May his name become well known in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. Indeed, your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Naomi took the child, placed him on her lap, and became a mother to him. This woman who said, "God has taken everything from me. I'm bitter. I have nothing left to live for," by the end of our story is holding her grandson in her arms, looking into his eyes, full of joy, of hope again, loving him to the point that our story says it's as if she was his mother, even though he's just her grandchild. That son's name is Obed, and he points us to the last redemption arc in this story, which is actually our redemption. Ruth points us forward to this reality that God is faithful to redeem us through Jesus. Through the story, it ends with a genealogy, which in our world today is kind of a lame way to end a story. We're like, why do we end with a genealogy? But it ends that way because it points us forward to what Ruth is really all about. We're told that Obed, Ruth's son, grows up, and he has a son named Jesse. And Jesse grows up, and Jesse has a son named David, and David becomes King David, who begins the line of kings that eventually gets us to Jesus. The story of Ruth, it is a story of a redeemer being born in the city of Bethlehem, and it points us forward to our Redeemer born in the city of Bethlehem, to Jesus who came to take all of our sin, all of our shame, all of our brokenness, our heartaches, our disappointments, our bitterness, our failures, everything that we can't deal with, and he deals with it. And then he restores to us the life that we lost, the relationship with God that we threw away, the honor that we haven't earned. That is the God that we serve. That's who he is. That's what Jesus does for us. He redeems us. And so as we finish this little story in our Old Testament, would you let it be a reminder to you that that same God is still at work today? The God who redeemed Ruth, the God who redeemed the line of Judah, the God who redeemed Elimelech and redeemed Naomi, he can redeem you also. And so where do you need him to meet you this morning? It's easy to believe that your problems are too big, and yet nothing is too big for God. I love Paul's reminder of this in Ephesians chapter 3. Now to him who is able to do above and beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations, forever and ever. Amen. And so would you join me this morning in giving glory and honor to our God, who is able to do more than we even think is possible, more than we even dare ask or imagine, because that's who he is and that's what he can do. Lord Jesus, we ask you to imprint that reality on our hearts this morning. We ask you to meet us in our most vulnerable place, that you would come near in our heartache and our frustration and our bitterness. Would you take what we've broken and would you make it whole again? And we know that you can, and we know that you will. And so give us the faith to believe that and help us to live in a way that makes that reality visible to the world around us. We ask that in Jesus' name. Amen.